the first thing to say is thank you very much for coming. Wonderful to see so many of you. I also want to say a huge thank you to Owl for hosting this event, and particularly to Catherine and Celine for staying on late and making sure everything goes smoothly. And I'm sure you'll agree that Owl is one of the jewels of Kentish Town and one of the things that makes NW5 special. And what I'm going to do this evening is talk about my new book. And it's both a book talk and a book launch. And I'm afraid it's just me, but I promise I won't ramble on for too long. And if I see you all slowly going away for your second and third glass of wine, I will get the message and wrap up. But the book is about the Siege of Sidney Street. It's called A Devilish Kind of Courage, which was actually how a News Chronicle, Daily Chronicle reporter described the two gunmen who were besieged in and died in Sidney Street. I begin with a quote. "Nothing of the sort had been seen within living memory in quiet, law-abiding, comfortable England." That quote is from the gentleman who was Home Secretary at the time of the Siege of Sidney Street and went hot foot to Stepney at the time of the siege to get a sense of the action. And the lyricism is rather cloying, but the substance is accurate. This was the most sensational shootout in London's history. Two men, a Latvian anarchist and a Russian, who probably wasn't an anarchist, managed to keep police and army sharpshooters at bay for fully 6 hours on the 3rd of January 1911 at a second-floor room in Sidney Street in Stepney. Over the course of that 6 hours, as far as I can make out, round about 1,000 bullets were fired one way and another. The gunmen inside the building were extremely well armed with a real arsenal of ammunition. And it followed on from an attempted armed robbery on a jeweller's shop in Houndsditch in the City of London a couple of weeks earlier, which led to what was and remains the most grievous incident in the history of London's police, when 3 London police officers were shot dead and 2 others sustained serious injuries and never were able to return to work. So that was, in a nutshell, the Siege of Sidney Street, but don't think you can go just yet. It was also a sensation for the news media. It happened in 1911 just as a popular press was developing. New forms of printing meant that you could actually print hundreds of thousands of copies per hour. And they also meant that newspapers could print action photographs rather than simply portrait photographs or line drawings. And this penny pamphlet was a distillation of the reporting and photographs of the Daily Chronicle, one of the main liberal daily papers of that time, and it appeared within 72 hours of the actual siege. Priced at a penny, you get the sense of sensation. You also get a sense of the real drama, the only complete account of the Houndsditch tragedies and the historic siege of foreign anarchists in the East End of London. And the siege was also captured by a brand new news platform, the newsreel. The newsreel had only started in the UK a matter of months earlier, but the Siege of Sidney Street, because it went on for so long and it was so relatively central, was one of those breaking stories which both journalists and camera operators could get to before it was all over. And there are 5 camera operators got to the siege and were able to film it. 3 of those films survive, and they're still available on YouTube. And some of their footage was shown in London cinemas the same day. This really was dramatic breaking news. And I mentioned the Home Secretary who penned those rather lyrical words about the Siege of Sidney Street. That is him. Recognise him. Winston Churchill, then 35, wearing a rather smart and dapper silk top hat. He was the Home Secretary, of course. He was the Home Secretary in a Liberal government, so he wasn't a Conservative at this time. In fact, he saw himself as a radical and a reforming Home Secretary. I'm not sure that's how others necessarily saw him, but that was his own self-image. And he had been a soldier. He'd fought in Sudan. He'd been a soldier stroke war correspondent in the Boer War in South Africa. He saw himself as a man of action. So when a shootout was happening and it was, within his bailiwick as Home Secretary, he went to the scene. And here he is with police, detectives, a Scots Guard, and a member of the London Fire Brigade. He had some fairly pointed discussions with the Fire Brigade. I'll get onto that a little later. Churchill recognised later it was an error of judgment to have gone in person. You've got your political boss at the scene, who then is in operational charge. The senior police officer, and there were two police forces involved, City of London and Metropolitan Police, or the senior army officer, or their political head, at least as far as the police is concerned. And to be honest, nobody really knew. And while Churchill insisted after the event, I wasn't directing anything, the journalists who were within earshot of what he was saying said that Churchill was always barking out instructions. That was very much his nature. And this is the other guy that you think of when you think of Sidney Street and the siege. It is Peter the Painter. Peter the Painter was a Latvian communist turned anarchist, an expropriator. In other words, he believed in committing armed robberies to raise funds for the movement and funds for the families of political prisoners. And he's associated with the Siege of Sidney Street, even though actually he wasn't there. And the police got this photograph from the Marseille police. Peter the Painter spent time in both the United States and in France before he came to London in late 1910. And look at him. I mean, dapper, wonderfully, one of those sort of Poirot-type moustaches, and also a studio portrait photograph. And it's the antithesis of what you might imagine the early 20th century anarchist to look like. You think of them as slightly scruffy, cloth cap or ill-fitting trousers, boots. Actually, that's the real thing. And when Peter the Painter was mentioned by various people that the police interviewed as one of the leaders of the Latvian anarchist group in London, which he was, and the police issued wanted posters for him. These are the two photographs they got from Marseille, which they issued in English and in Yiddish and in Russian. So posters were issued in three languages. Of course, Peter the Painter, actually, he's known, if anything, because he's seen as an East End anti-hero. And a large part of that is this very alliterative nickname, Peter the Painter. Actually, who devised that? The London police. It was a translation of almost certainly a Latvian nickname. He was a commercial painter. He painted for a livelihood, not fine art, just simply sort of industrial and decorating type painting. But it is curious that the police came up with that nickname, which has this clear echo of Jack the Ripper. Peter the Painter, Jack the Ripper, another East End anti-hero from a generation earlier. And of course, as far as the police are concerned, nobody's ever been able to put a definitive name to either Jack the Ripper or Peter the Painter. But actually, the police knew the name of Jack the Ripper, not straight away, but by the end of the following year. His name was Janis Zaklis. They knew exactly where his family farm was in Latvia. They didn't know where he was himself, but they knew the name. But because they didn't have the evidence to extradite or convict, they just basically blanked out on it. They never admitted that they knew his name. And when police in Australia, in about 1916, 1917, got in touch with the police in London and said, "We think we've arrested Peter the Painter," the London police basically replied, "Sorry, we're not interested." So whether they got the real guy or not, we don't know. Probably they hadn't. But in any case, the London police said, as far as we're concerned, there's nothing to be done. We don't have the evidence to extradite or to convict. I like this photograph. This is a group of Latvian anarchists. Again, very well dressed. I mean, the anarchists in Latvia, and indeed the sort of left-wing rebels, they weren't all anarchists, they tended to be well educated, bright. They were the young intellectuals of Latvia. This was given by the Latvian police to the consul, the British consul in the Latvian capital, Riga, who sent it on to the London police because it was believed that some of these Latvians had spent time in London. That one had. In fact, she had as well. He was on the fringes of the gang responsible for the Houndsditch robbery attempt and also Sidney Street. But it does reveal something of the mood of the time. It gives you something of a feel of the type of people these were. So what happened in Latvia to make so many people turn to anarchism, and not just anarchism, because anarchism does not in itself imply violence at all, but to using guns and political violence. Basically in 1905, when a revolution started in St. Petersburg, mass basically uprising against the Tsar's rule, it spread very quickly to Latvia, which is not very far from St. Petersburg. Latvia is quite small, population now of about 2 million, but it was more prosperous than most of the Russian-ruled areas at the time. It was part of the Russian Empire. It was more industrialized. It had 2 leading ports. So there was a lot happening there. And when people in Latvia started staging protests, which were both against Tsarist rule and to some extent actually Latvian nationalist or proto-nationalist at least, they met very heavy repression. On one infamous incident, police opened fire on a big protest march in Riga. This is 1905. And a lot of the demonstrators, to escape the gunfire, went on to the ice, which was on top of the main river that runs through Riga, which is a very broad river at that point. The ice gave way, and it's estimated about 200 of the demonstrators drowned in that single incident. And as the Tsarist forces managed to re-establish control over Latvia, they used Cossacks in particular, who were notoriously brutal. They used very vicious leather whips, they tortured, they executed, and they were also responsible for sexual violence. So some, at least among the young Latvians who were resisting Tsarist rule, thought the only way of actually meeting this threat was by using weapons themselves. And they raised money and they bought weapons on the black market, and they bought really quite powerful semi-automatic weapons. And when the Social Democrats, which is brackets Marxists at the time, decided that they were going to enter the political mainstream and stand for elections, another more militant group decided that they didn't want to do that, and they become associated with anarchism. And there was a Latvian diasporic anarchist movement in France, in Germany, in the United States, and to a small extent here in the UK as well. And about 2,000 Latvians went into exile, including the people who were responsible for the Houndsditch robbery attempt. When the Latvians came to London, most of them weren't actually Jewish, but they tended to settle in the Jewish East End, which was the home of most of the Jewish migrants escaping pogroms in the Russian Empire. And in the Jewish East End, there was already a strong Yiddish-speaking anarchist movement led by this guy, Rudolf Rocker, a German Gentile who had taught himself Yiddish. They had their own conspicuously successful weekly paper in Yiddish, Der Arbeiterfeind. I probably haven't got the pronunciation completely right, but it translates, as you can see, to the worker's friend. And they had a really big anarchist club in a former nonconformist church. This is a drawing of it in Jubilee Street in Stepney, which had a meeting space on the ground floor for 300 or 400, and it had space on the upper floor. It had a library, it had a cafe, and anybody could go in there. You didn't have to be a member to use the club facilities. And this is the spot where the Latvian exiles met, socialized. ate food they were familiar with, spoke in Latvian and Russian, were able to read the political papers from the Baltic and from the Russian Empire. It was, in a sense, their political home, even though Rocca was absolutely against expropriation and political violence. There were probably a number of robberies and attempted robberies that the Latvians were responsible for, some of which we don't know about because they got away with it. One that they didn't get away with is when they tried to did a wages heist from a rubber factory in Tottenham. They got away with the wages money at first, but they hadn't really thought it through because the rubber factory was directly from here to those books over there, opposite Tottenham police station, which also had a section house on the upper floor, which was basically accommodation for young unmarried police officers. So when the hue and cry was raised, the police officers in the station and in the section house bundled out the doors and windows and went in pursuit, along with a large part of the local population of Tottenham. And these were two Latvian anarchists with the money in their hands and weapons, basically made their way, ran, ambled, occasionally turned round and fired a few shots at those following them, all the way across the marshes. In Walthamstow, they hijacked a tram, but couldn't quite work out how to get it to move properly. So they got off the tram and they hijacked a milk float, and then that didn't quite work. So they hijacked a vegetable seller's cart, all the time being pursued by police and a group of wildfowl hunters that saw them on the marshes, all sorts of people. And it was comic. It is farcical. Alas, 4 people died. So the anarchists shot dead a police officer in Tottenham and a 9-year-old boy who was part of the crowd. And both the gunmen suffered fatal injuries themselves. But this sort of set the scene for Latvian staging armed crime. And then this is Harris's jewellery shop in Houndsditch, which the Latvian anarchists decided that they would rob. In the safe here, there was jewellery worth, by today's values, almost £1 million, so a big amount. And this was a much more formidable exercise. So the anarchists actually were well prepared. They had cutting equipment, they had a gas canister, they had picks and axes and hammers. And what they did is they didn't go in from the front, they went in from the back. This is Exchange Buildings. The shape of it can still be seen in the East End, though the buildings themselves have been demolished. And this row backed on to Houndsditch. And the anarchists hired a house. Actually, it's the same house where that woman is peering out of. The house was 3 stories, but there was only one small room on each story. And they excavated from the back of that house into the back of the jewellery store with the hope that they would get through and they would be able to break the safe and scarper with the money. Wasn't a bad plan, and they'd thought it through to the extent that this was, at the time, a Jewish area. So the local population, resident population were Jewish, the businesses were Jewish. So they started burrowing in late on a Friday evening, confident that the shops wouldn't open again till the Sunday morning. The shops were all observed the Jewish Sabbath. But Jewish Sabbath is also, for those who are observing it, quite a quiet time. So the streets were quiet, the houses were quiet. So one of the people who lived nearby heard all the clatter, clatter, clatter and thought something's wrong and went out to find a policeman. In those days, you could just walk on the street and expect that you might find somebody in uniform. The policeman came to Exchange Buildings, actually knocked on the door, spoke to one of the people inside, realised that probably something fishy was going on, made his excuses and left. Strangely, the Latvians who were already inside, 5 of them, busily burrowing away, you might have thought this would be their cue to get out. But they didn't. And about 40 minutes later, 9 police officers turned up, none of them armed, and one of them knocked on the door opened, he walked through the door to Exchange Buildings, he was met by a hail of gunfire, reeled back, and then at least 3 men with guns emerged from Exchange Buildings, firing at every police officer they could see. And within a matter of probably less than a minute, 3 police officers had suffered fatal injuries and 2 others had been seriously wounded. So as I said earlier, there's not been a single more serious event in the history of the police in London, single event. And the police were sort of in a state of shock, basically looking after their wounded, and the perpetrators scarpered. Except, this is a memorial card for the 3 police officers who died. They had a funeral service at St Paul's with Winston Churchill in attendance. This was, a real focus of national attention and concern. But one of the leading figures in the gang, George Gardstein, was accidentally shot by his colleagues as they were firing at the police. And 2 of his colleagues supported him round their shoulders and walked him away as if he was a Friday night drunk. And a woman, well-dressed woman, was seen walking with them towards the heart of the Jewish East End. And they took Gardstein back to actually the room that Peter the Painter lived in at that time in Whitechapel. And the following morning, Gardstein died of his injuries. These are post-mortem photographs taken and issued by the police to try and identify him and find out more about him. Under his mattress, they found a semi-automatic weapon. They also found ammunition, anarchist literature, though not in English, and letters and photos, some of which was being very actively burnt in the grate by a woman accomplice as the police walked into the building. In fact, she carried on burning stuff until the police physically stopped her. The police carried out a load of searches of the rooms of perpetrators or suspected perpetrators, and they found lots of documents, letters, all sorts of things, all of which are in the files of the City of London Police Force and the London Metropolitan Archives. A lot of the photographs are wonderfully elegiac, though almost all, frustratingly, are unlabelled. But this is George Gardstein. It was found in his room. Even the police commented, having seen him only after death, how tall and good-looking he was. And I don't know who the woman is, but I don't think it's his sister somehow. The Latvian anarchists, there's quite a telling description by a London Gentile street criminal who was interviewed by Raphael Samuel probably about 50 years ago now, who knew these guys. He said they used to walk down Brick Lane, always in the middle of the road. There'd be a gang of 15 of them or so, and they always had women with them, and they were good lookers. So that was the sort of style. So these guys they were swashbuckling, they were slightly entitled, they had that sort of sense of confidence. But in the aftermath of the death of Gardstein and of the police officers, the key people in the group ran. So Peter the Painter, who was not present at Houndsditch, but almost certainly was being used as a conduit for whatever had been robbed if it was successful, he probably got away by sea to the Netherlands within a day or two. Another of the group managed to get out to France within a matter of hours, it would seem. A couple of others, Fritz Vars and William Sokolov, didn't leave London, but they hid out in the room of Sokolov's lover, Betsy Gershon, on the 2nd floor of 100 Sidney Street in Stepney, which was also just about 100 yards from the Anarchist Club in Jubilee Street, which is the next big road along. So they stayed there, basically not spotted even by the other residents of the house, as far as we can tell, for about 2 weeks. And one of them wrote this letter. Anybody recognise the language? You can't answer this one, Zina. You've got it. This is a letter, handwritten letter in Latvian by one of the Latvian anarchists involved in the Houndsditch robbery and the shooting of the police officers, who was Fritz Sfars, who was besieged in Sidney Street. This he wrote a day or two before the siege started. It was to his family in Latvia. Things were fairly bad, and he gave a sense of that in the letter. One of the things he said is, 2 weeks I've been on the run. How much longer I can manage, I don't know. To leave soon doesn't bear thinking about because they're guarding all the roads intensely. I'm not at all depressed because everyone knows that one has to die at some time. And he gave this letter to a comrade to send back to the family in Latvia. That comrade, we're not quite sure of the identity of this person, was a police informer. Probably an opportunist police informer, so not probably somebody on the police's books, but somebody who actually thought they would get, a handful of money for informing on the whereabouts of the two wanted men. So they were given away by this informer. But I'm just going to go at a tangent just for 1 minute. So the letter is still in the London Metropolitan Archives. It never reached Latvia until last October. Quite by chance, sort of almost one of those coincidences which you scratch your head and believe, can this really be true? But through the wife of a very good friend who helped me with translation of Latvian inscriptions, I managed to make contact with the family of Fritz Sfars, the man who died in 100 Sidney Street. Margarita is the great-granddaughter of Fritz Sfars' sister, Olga, and Lena is her daughter. And my daughter and I went over in October to Riga and handed over a copy of the letter. And they knew that they had a rebel in their family history, but they were unaware of any letter. And they're not proud, but neither are they ashamed of having somebody like Fritz Sfars in their family story. And if you're wondering why she's holding chopsticks, well, we did meet in a Chinese restaurant. And if you're ever going to Riga, I'd recommend both Riga and this Chinese restaurant. So on the 3rd of January, 7 o'clock in the morning, the police had surrounded 100 Sidney Street. They'd managed to get everybody out of the house except the two gunmen, and probably about a couple of hundred police there. Maybe 15 or 20 of them were armed, but the police had very poor arms, so it was old-fashioned rifles and pistols, which might well have been carried over from army service in the Boer War or whatever. And they had a perimeter, a large perimeter around 100 Sidney Street. And at 7 o'clock in the morning, a police officer went and threw gravel at the second floor window where the two gunmen were believed to be hiding. And that was met by a volley of gunfire from within. So that's when the siege started. The gunmen had Mauser semi-automatic pistols. They were called the broom handle pistols. The IRA used them in 1916 in the Easter Rising. They were much more effective than anything that the police had available. So after 3 hours of fairly desultory exchanges of gunfire, the police said, "We're not winning this one, we need the military." And they asked and were given permission to get the army to help them on the streets of East London. So these guys here were among 24 Scots Guards who came out from the Tower of London, again with rifles. You can see by this time, this is mid-morning now, most of the police on duty were on crowd control duty rather than actually directly trying to nab the gunmen. And if you can see here, all these windows and balconies here, everybody is crowding round. The East End came just about to a stop. It was a spectacle, almost a carnival. EastEnders were very hostile to the gunmen, but they relished the sense of theatre that they had brought to the streets, at least for one day. So Churchill, that's him again. I just love this guy here, you see. Yeah. This was circulated as a postcard. It sold in tens of thousands. and sometimes some of them cropped out the guy on the top waving at the camera, but I think it's much nicer actually with him in. Churchill was very frustrated that actually he was finding out more about what was happening in Stepney from the first edition of the Evening News than he was via Scotland Yard and the City Police. So he said, right, I'm going. And not only did he go there, I mean, as you can see, he's peering out, looking slightly nervous at that particular time, but actually being quite bold in how he positioned himself. He was certainly within range of the Latvians if they had chosen to fire in his direction. I don't think he ever was targeted. No shots were fired at him. But as I say, it did cause a huge amount of confusion about who was in charge of the operation. At this stage, there was only policemen surrounding him. Later, you'd got army officers and fire brigade officers also turning him to say, so what do you want us to do? But as the firing continued, the police got really worried that this might extend beyond nightfall, which at that time of year, this is January, would have been 4 o'clock. So they did something which is really quite remarkable. They called up Maxim machine guns and field artillery from St John's Wood and positioned them on the back streets of Stepney. Happily, they didn't use either machine guns or field guns, but I don't think there's any other time that I can think of when such heavy weapons have been deployed in the streets of London in peacetime or in wartime. In fact, just deploying police and police opening fire in London in support, troops opening fire in London in support of the police. I tried very hard to find out when was the last time it happened before the Siege of Sidney Street. I think it was in the demonstrations after the Napoleonic Wars, so 1816, 1820, where police certainly did, troops certainly did open fire. After 1911, when was the next occasion when troops opened fire in support of the police in London?
This is taking out the Iranian siege.
Yeah, siege.
He knows too much, this man. So it was the Iranian embassy siege in 1980, as far as I can make out. So there was, for 170 years, the Siege of Sidney Street was the only time, as far as I can make out, when troops were deployed at the request of the police and opened fire on the streets of London. About 1 o'clock, after 6 hours of shooting, the first wisps of smoke appeared out of 100 Sidney Street. Nobody's quite sure how the fire started, but when the fire brigade got to the scene, they were initially told by the police that the police were firing out burglars, with a clear implication that the police had started the blaze. And the following day's papers all reported the police started the fire, which was then promptly denied by the Home Office. The truth of the matter is rather difficult to establish. What is beyond doubt is that Churchill himself personally forbade the fire brigade from attempting to put out the flames. He said, you will not try to put out the flames. And actually 100 Sidney Street basically burnt down. So by 2:30 or so, when the fire brigade entered the building, it was charred. The first floor had entirely collapsed onto the ground floor, and they found 2 very charred bodies on the ground floor. One was so charred that they didn't spot it for several hours. So it was that bad. The inquest found that one of the 2 gunmen had died of gunshot wounds. The other had suffocated to death from smoke inhalation. So that decision not to allow the fire brigade to put out the flames arguably led to the death of one of the gunmen. The press thought it was wonderful. They got access to a local pub. They paid the publican a sovereign each just to be allowed to be on the roof. He must have made more by allowing his roof to be used as a vantage point than he took in a month, I would have thought. And the Daily Mirror, which was the biggest pictorial daily paper of the time, not only devoted its entire front page the following day to the Siege of Sidney Street, inside, in total, it published 20 photographs from or about Sidney Street. It was a real feeding frenzy. There was a very negative side to that, which is although, as I say, most of the Latvian anarchists were not Jewish, it led to a real chorus of unpleasant anti-Semitism. So this is a cartoon which appeared in the People, the Sunday People, a mainstream paper. It shows rats labelled undesirable alien. Alien was the standard term for recent Jewish migrants to London. The rats have clearly Semitic features, and you have somebody in a foreign country in uniform telling the rats to clear out, and they're all making their way out through the spaces between the slats in a gate marked Aliens Act. There had been an Aliens Act in 1905, which was the first attempt to limit mass immigration to Britain. It wasn't very effective, and the message of this is, because that act's not very effective, all sorts of undesirables are flooding into the country. The People also published a doggerel poem which called for the immediate expulsion from Britain of every single Jew. And this was in a mainstream paper of the time. So that was the tone. It was a doggerel poem. It wasn't reflected in the editorial content of the paper, but nevertheless, the paper felt it could give space to that sort of poisonous anti-Semitic sentiment. The government, the Liberal government, came under huge pressure to tighten up the Aliens Act or to limit the right of asylum. And the government of the day did think about doing that and even drafted legislation. In the end, it did precisely nothing. So it actually ignored the clamour of demands from the media and from the right for repressive legislation or tighter legislation to limit immigration. The only policy move was that actually the police, London police, were allocated much more powerful weapons for those moments when they needed to respond to armed crime. We're getting towards the end now, but I just love this. This is Nina Vasilieva. What a glower. It's her arrest photograph. So most of the leaders of the anarchist gang were either dead or had fled. But the authorities were under huge pressure to still stage a trial. 3 police dead, 2 seriously injured. There's also the suspicion that there must have been a much larger group which were in some way complicit in the robbery attempt. So 8 people were charged, 3 of them women, with complicity in the police murders and the robbery. 4 of the cases collapsed before they got to trial at the Old Bailey. Only 1 person was convicted, Nina. She had nothing to do with the weapons, though she had been seen close to the spot of the burglary. She had appeared to live in Exchange buildings. She was certainly an anarchist. She was the lover of George Gardstein, the dead anarchist. She was convicted of basically conspiracy to rob, and she was sentenced to 2 years. The jury that convicted her also added a rider to their verdict, asking the judge not to recommend her for deportation. They thought, she'd been involved, but they didn't want her to be deported back to the Russian Empire with the possibility that she could then be tortured or killed. 6 weeks later, her appeal came up, very quick appeal, in front of the Lord Chief Justice, and she was cleared. It's quite remarkable. She was an anarchist. There's no doubt about that. She was the lover of somebody who was clearly involved in the killing of 3 police officers. She had what you might call an irregular personal life. And yet the Lord Chief Justice accepted evidence that he was given that she was, in essence, a respectable woman, and she was cleared. In the late 1920s, the authorities made another attempt to deport her. She, by that time, was working for the Soviet trade delegation officers in London, and they were a nest of, they were suspected of being at the heart of a Soviet espionage ring in London. So her past history was excavated, and they said she's got to go. Don't know quite what happened, but she never went. She died on Brick Lane in 1963, so she lived to an old age. What she thought about her youthful activities, really don't know. But she's a really interesting character, and she had attitude. You know, when the police found a sealed envelope in her bag and said, "Who's this from?" she said, "I found it on the street." I mean, come on. So that's the Siege of Sidney Street, recited in the book. Also in the book, there are details of 2 self-guided walks with maps. One in Tottenham, the part of the route taken by the Tottenham anarchists as they fled across the marches, and the other from the scene of the Houndsditch robbery all the way to Sidney Street, where the siege took place. I'm going to be leading one of those walks at the Hackney History Festival in May. The books are available here, and if you are tempted to buy the book, do buy it here and support Owl. And if you have any questions or comments, the floor is yours.
You said a lot about the who, the what, the when and the where. Not so much about the why. Could you sort of say why these people did what they did, and also situate them in the wider anarchist movement that was going on?
Yeah.
You mentioned something about the difference between people that believed in violence.
Yeah. It's difficult to be sure about the why, because we don't have any testimony from some of the key people. So there is not a single word that we know of, certainly not from his time in London, of Peter the Painter. Not even reported speech of what he said privately. It's certainly the case that Latvian anarchists and social democrats had developed a custom of expropriation to support their movement and also to support the families of political prisoners. There were thousands, literally thousands of political prisoners. They were mainly breadwinners. Their families got no welfare support. So the movement felt they had a duty to help them provide a basic level of financial support. So that's part of the why. Why they took this form of revolutionary expropriation to London, which was a completely different culture, is much more difficult to read. Except the Latvian group, they were very inward-looking. Nina Vasileva had quite good English. Most of the rest had very, very little English. One or two of the Latvians, one in particular, Jacob Peters, was a member of a British social democratic movement, Social Democratic Party, which became the British Socialist Party. Most did not have any political associations beyond the Latvian and the Baltic movement, apart from perhaps some of the people they met at Jubilee Street. What does seem to be the case is that there was a sort of marriage of convenience in the gang between Latvians who had at some stage had an association with the anarchist movement. They were involved with a journal called Līsma, which in Latvian means flame, and the name of the group was the Līsma Group. How well organized it was, it's very difficult to tell. But they seem to have made common cause with some Russians who were not political emigres, but they were good at crime, who had a track record of helping with robberies. One of whom, Sokolov, who died in Sidney Street with Fritz Vars, was a Russian. He was a watchmaker. And you could imagine that a watchmaker could have really quite useful skills if you're trying to break into a safe. What's more, he had been a sort of manager of a jewellery shop in Old Street when that jewellery shop was robbed. And the police interviewed him at the time. Now, did he do it? I don't know, but I must say, I think the police must have felt a little bit green and naive when they went back and we discovered that actually the guy that died in Sidney Street had been a suspect in another robbery, but they'd never managed to get the evidence. How did they relate to the wider anarchist movement? Well, the European anarchist movement was largely, at least the luminaries of the European anarchist movement were in London at that time. Kropotkin was in London. The Italian Enrico Malatesta was in London. Rudolf Rocca was in London. These were the three big intellectual figures of European anarchism at that time. I mean, there were some French figures, but them in particular. Kropotkin's pamphlets were found in the rooms of the Latvians. Malatesta, probably innocently, supplied the oxygen canister which was used in the attempt to burrow through into the back of the jewellery store. I say probably innocently. He was questioned by the police. Yeah, he was probably innocent. Malatesta had an electrician's workshop, engineering workshop in Islington. Rocker admitted that quite a few of the gang had been regulars at the Jubilee Street Club, and actually when Vasileva was cleared on appeal, Rocker and his wife put her up for a few weeks until she got herself sorted out. But Rocker in particular argued very strongly against anarchist violence, particularly in London. He basically said, anarchists from so many countries have found a refuge in London. We're able to meet, we're able to propagandize, we don't have major problems with the authorities. If you come and stage acts of terror here, he didn't use the word terror, but that's what he was talking about, that could all change. The political pressure will be cracked down on these foreign anarchists, and we will all suffer as a result. So what you're doing is counterproductive to the movement. And that would have been the mainstream view, certainly in the Jubilee Street Club. The Arbiter Freund commissioned an article from Malatesta a few weeks after Sidney Street, and Malatesta said, what is killing policemen to do with anarchism? They were criminals. This wasn't anarchism, this was crime. I mean, he had a particular narrative to support at that time, but nevertheless, I think that was his view.
Do you think they might have known that the police were generally not armed, which was unusual then as it is now?
I think that they would certainly have known the police were not armed, and it was such a big contrast with what they were used to in the Baltic states. But I don't think they gave any thought to, I mean, what surprises me is they weren't more disciplined in the use of weapons, especially after the Tottenham outrage, where, you know, as I say, a policeman had been shot dead and a bystander was shot dead. You'd have thought they would be very cautious about using weapons. After all, you know, they had a chance to run for it before the police arrived in force. They knew that, you know, a policeman was at the very least suspicious, and they simply chose to carry on regardless, which you might regard as courageous, but I think most people would say it was criminally reckless.
What about the other side? I mean, what happened to the families of the policemen who were dead? What happened to the police in general?
So the King's Police Medal was introduced after the Tottenham outrage, and quite a few of the police officers involved were awarded the King's Police Medal. Almost everybody involved was given a promotion and a reward. The police officer who was killed in Tottenham, his very smart, distinguished grave still stands in Abney Park Cemetery. The 3 police officers killed at Sidney Street, they had funeral service at St Paul's. The 2 sergeants were buried beside each other in rather imposing graves in the City of London cemetery in Ilford. Though rather sadly, one of the sergeants had, there's a second interment in his grave. His wife was pregnant at the time of her husband's death, gave birth to a boy who died at the age of 3 from influenza. So that 3-year-old son is buried with his father in Ilford. There was quite a, I mean, the police officers got compensation if they were injured. So did a lot of members of the public, and actually the most voluminous files are the compensation files. So people wanted compensation for everything. So in Tottenham, somebody asked for compensation because an overweight police officer borrowed his bike and damaged it. Another wanted compensation because the policeman bled to death in his room when he was moved in from the street and stained the carpet. Another wanted compensation because his donkey was pulling a cart which was shot in the case of in the course of the chase, and they wanted £5 for the donkey, and the adjudicating official said £5 is much too much for a donkey in the East End. I think they were given £1.10, so they were given £1.50. So there was the police, as you would expect and as they should, looked after their own. But nevertheless, what I also have to say is you know, you think of the pressure on the police after they'd lost 3 of their own fellow officers. There's no suggestion that any of the suspects were roughed up. Some of the identity parades were probably not done by the book, with some suggestions. That's the one, that's the one. But there was no verbalsing, and in court, the defendants were given the benefit of the doubt, as they should be. And there's no doubt that some of the people who were charged were involved in some way, but the evidence wasn't there, and they were acquitted.
Thanks for your talk. Fascinating. I've got 2 questions, if I may. The one is, first of all, I was thinking of Joseph Conrad's The Secret Agent. As you were speaking, I kept on having this vision. And of course, then that was, I think, the 1890s, when anarchists were the big threat, perceived threat. But I thought it sort of died down. I must be wrong, because it popped up again as a movement. I was just interested in the parabola of anarchist movement.
So, anarchism as a insurgent movement really didn't very much exist in Britain. So you had the Greenwich outrage, which I think was 1894, which was the basis for Conrad's A Secret Agent. You had a bit of a conspiracy in Walsall, which was almost certainly a sort of setup by an agent provocateur. And you had the series of armed robberies by Latvians, which culminated in the Siege of Sidney Street. Basically, there wasn't anything else in terms of a movement. But the thing that you remember from Conrad's book is the sort of the air of subterfuge, informers, embassies involved, and actually you do get a sense of that in the papers, the City of London police papers. Special branch files from this haven't survived, but Special Branch clearly, that they'd been formed in the 1870s, had not done a good job of keeping tabs on anarchists within migrant communities, and they were slightly embarrassed about that. And the police turned to the Soviet Consul General for help in translating, for information indirectly from the Russian police forces. And there is this letter, slightly peremptory letter on file from the Soviet Consul General to the Commissioner of the London Police, saying, I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but saying something about that gentleman that introduced you to you the other day, you must make no direct approach to him. If you want to make contact with him again, you must do so with my advance knowledge and approval, and I will arrange a meeting place. But I must ask you to understand that you must make no direct approach to this gentleman under any circumstances. So it's basically saying this is a Russian intelligence asset that the London police just need to treat with a little bit of respect. And there's no doubt that the Russian secret police at the time, the Okhrana, were more effective in keeping tabs on political hardliners from across the Russian Empire than the Special Branch here were.
So it's not the Soviet, it's the Russian.
This is the Okhrana.
The Okhrana, but the Okhrana was pre-Soviet.
Yes. So, but one of the people who was acquitted of charges for the robbery was Jacob Peters, who later was the deputy head of the Cheka, which is the Soviet secret police. So one of the strange things, I mean, the anarchist movement in the East End of London basically died during the First World War. A lot of them, when the Russian Revolution happened, thought, okay, it's not quite our revolution, but it's the only revolution going. We're going to go back and support it. Kropotkin went back and supported it and died in Moscow. Rudolf Rocker tried to go to Russia, but couldn't quite manage it. And a lot of East End Jewish anarchists went back to Moscow and to support the revolution. I met one or two of them 30 or so years ago in their old age. So that movement died, and actually one of them, the woman who went back to Moscow, then went to Palestine and came back to London in the late 1920s. In 1914, she came from Poland to London as a young, energetic, enthusiastic anarchist. She sold the Arbeiterfreund, the rockers' paper. When she came back 10 years later, she said, London is a cemetery. It stinks. What she was saying is the movement has died. it's just a few old people. There's nothing left of it. And that was true, and the movement went within just a few years. Thank you ever so much for coming. And obviously there are books on sale if you would like them, and there's wine to be drunk as well.